Norcross along with Luke Dorris. This is the podcast. What is this? Is the second one of this year. We've been doing tropical weather for so long here this year, Luke. Already, I can't believe it's only the third day of June.
We have the second podcast and the third named storm of the season.
And that's in the record book.
Yeah.
We've never had that before.
So first things first, pronunciation. Cristobal.
Yeah.
How do you pronounce this?
Cristobal. If you say it, it's a Spanish word, right? But in English, Cristobal. The accent is on the toe.
I sound like such a fraud. I feel like such a fraud sometimes whenever I try to pronounce it correctly.
Cristobal.
But there we go.
There you go. So this is, as I said, the second podcast of the season, and it has been quite a season so far, record-setting up to the sea storm, the earliest ever, and we hasten to add that doesn't say anything about what's going to happen in August, September, and October. That's what the records say, right?
Yeah.
So today, though, we're going to talk with Ken Graham, the director of the National Hurricane Center. We'll get his thoughts on what's going on this season and, of course, what's new for 2020 and the lessons we learned in 2019. And we certainly did learn lessons with Dorian. We're recording this podcast on Wednesday, June 3rd, 2020. If you're listening at some point in the future, for the latest weather, you've got to tune into Channel 10 in South Florida, or local10.com, where we do stream all the Local 10 newscasts. So anytime the news is on, starting at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, for example, all the way to 6:30, we're on the air, and you can go to local10.com and watch that, or, of course, at 11 o'clock at night, or noon, or 9 in the morning, or 4:30 to 7. It's all online live. Also, there's the Max Tracker Hurricane app and the Local 10 Weather Authority app, and of course all those have the current information. And be on the watch for the newsletter. If you go on local10.com, you can sign up for the newsletter called From Bryan Norcross. So in the morning, I kind of write a synopsis of what's going on, what I think the threats are, especially oriented towards South Florida. And you can get that there, and I'll keep you up to date, and it'll be emailed to you every day as soon as we publish it, which is normally kind of first thing in the morning on every day that there's any kind of threat. All right, so let's talk about Cristobal and what's going on with that today. It came ashore as we're recording this on Wednesday afternoon. Its center is over Mexico. And what happens next? That's the big question.
Yeah, so 60 miles per hour roughly is what it had at landfall. So pretty strong tropical storm upon landfall in Mexico. And what it looks like now, and what the big question is this is going to meander near or overland through roughly Thursday night, Friday morning. How long it remains overland and what kind of vortex we have left by the end of the week is really going to determine its future from there, right?
Yes, but there's another big complication, and that is that it is inside a bigger low pressure system, right? This Central American gyre that we talked about last week, I think, on the podcast, right? And so the question is, if the central circulation of Cristobal gets wiped out, then what's left if the whole system is the new storm, right? There is no core kind of related to Cristobal. It's going to be very interesting from a National Hurricane Center standpoint, and we'll talk to Ken about this. Will it still be Cristobal? Because the rule nominally is if the circulation remains. So in other words, this was not Amanda, because Amanda came from the Pacific, ran into the mountains there in southern Mexico. That central circulation got disrupted at the surface, and then when it reformed off of the north, it was a new circulation that formed. So if Cristobal's circulation kind of dissipates, but the circulation of the big low around it continues, is that going to count as the same system or not?
And if it did, would that be the earliest D storm on record?
Well, if they counted as a different circulation, yeah, that would rate, assuming it got to tropical storm strength, which the models indicate that it will, that would be a D storm. But anyway, so that's sort of a the rules don't take into account every exact situation, and this is a pretty weird one. But the general issue is if the storm loses its core and it really does end up being a big, broad circulation with a big old eye, then what that's going to do is tend to drive the weather out from the eye. The strongest winds won't be anywhere kind of right around the center. They'll be displaced a good ways, or the radius of maximum winds will be 50 or 60 or 70 miles. So it becomes like maybe it's more a subtropical storm, not a tropical storm. And that tends to push the bad weather farther to the east as well. So along with the upper air flow that's going to push the bad weather to the east anyway. So, that pushes it in the direction of Florida, which would increase the odds, I think, of our feeling some more fringe effects here than if it stays more organized with more of a core.
Both scenarios lead to the possibility of, or likelihood of, some sort of tropical or subtropical system making direct impacts on the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf states later on this weekend or early next week, right?
Yeah, that looks very logical and likely because the weather pattern that's developing is a very well-established weather pattern. It's like big dominant features coming into play that generally the computer forecast models predict pretty well. Now, the exact details of exactly where if the center would go over, the Texas-Louisiana line or Louisiana-Mississippi line or closer to New Orleans or something else, that's another question. But the details, but the general idea of this corridor to the north moving on up, that will almost certainly happen. We believe that the models have a good handle on that. So people in the northern Gulf Coast generally need to be ready for something to happen there. I see you just got light. That's good.
Yeah, light came in and an extension cord for my headphones.
All right. Well, the next time I start talking, then why don't you just change out your headphones because I can see your extension cord is tight. All right. So this let's talk about the Central American gyre situation for just 1 second. The Central American gyre is an area of low pressure that forms over Central America. It's one of those things that's kind of like the polar vortex, right? Nobody in the public ever heard of the polar vortex till a few years ago. And it does have a kind of a cool name, and that got picked up in the media, and suddenly people all talk about the polar vortex. The Central American gyre is caused by the way the winds from the Atlantic come in, and they're kind of strong in the early part of the season and the late part of the season. And then the Pacific winds kind of, if you get a westerly wind, an extra westerly wind burst. You back? Hey, Luke, can you hear me?
I'm back.
Okay, great. So I was talking about the Central American gyre as being caused by the winds from the Atlantic coming in on the east. So they get an east wind on the north side of Central America. And on the occasion, and it usually happens early in the hurricane season or late in the spring or toward the end of the hurricane season, you get kind of a westerly wind in the Pacific. And so that gets the air spinning over Central America and this gyre. And a gyre is just a large spinning weather system. They use that word in the Pacific for the kind of hurricane-y type systems you get out there that have a big old eye. They're kind of like a giant tire, and it's called a gyre. There's also a gyre in the ocean, a big swirling area of swirling water is called a gyre. Anyway, so that's what that word is, which isn't a very common English word.
Well, yeah, you're talking about the water. That happens sometimes in the Gulf of Mexico, right? Didn't Hurricane Katrina go over a water gyre that was basically a supercharger of warm water that it got to sit over for some time? Is that correct? Yeah, you
get this rotation, but generally the word gyre, I do remember it being used for that, but generally the word gyre is used like in the Atlantic, you have a circulation that kind of goes with the high pressure system and the water goes all the way around. And in the Pacific, there is that gyre of trash in the middle of the Pacific, which is a huge rotating area of trash, right? That's what that word is used for. So anyway, you've heard about the Central American gyre. It's been picked up now with social media. People are used to the word, but and it's not at all unusual to have it happen. It's not unusual to have it spin off a storm. Hurricane Michael in 2018 came out of the Central American gyre. A lot of Pacific storms come out of the Central American gyre. They're just kind of the spinning gyre breaks off a piece, and that becomes an entity all in of itself. Now, what's different here, and somewhat unusual, I'm sure it's happened before, but I don't remember it, is that this tropical storm has gotten caught inside the Central American gyre, inside the big low pressure system. So it's been making a little loop right by Mexico, caught inside there. And what's going to happen is a dip in the jet stream is going to come along and disrupt the gyre, essentially lift the whole thing, Cristobal, if it exists anymore, and the gyre to the north. And that's going to go up toward the Gulf Coast. So it's a big, massive area of disturbed weather heading to the north. So that's the sequence that's going to happen. And what will be left of the core of that, which is the current Cristobal, that's what we don't know. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah. So by the end of the week, we should have a better idea, but you can't really know much until then, right?
Yeah. Well, we can't. Yeah, because it really depends on how long Cristobal stays over land. Does it lose its inner core circulation? Like when we look at it on the radar right now, we see a lot of thunderstorms, especially on the right side of it, right near the center. So it's very tropical right now. Mm-hmm. But is that going to get disrupted by the friction with the land? And to what degree? Depending on the model you look at, some of them just completely wipe out that circulation. And so what goes north is a giant circulation. And the strong winds are displaced to the east of the center, way to the east of the center. For example, if the center were to go over Louisiana, the strong winds are showing over Alabama and the Florida Panhandle, like hundreds of miles to the east. So that's not really a tropical system. So we may get into another kind of mnemonic pretzel with this thing of why it's the name it is or why it's not the name it is, and that it's subtropical and all that. But we'll see. All right, one more thing I wanted to talk about is this issue of when hurricane season begins, because I wanted to ask Ken Graham about his thoughts on that. So we talked a bit about this last week. Now that all this has happened, have we changed our mind at all that hurricane season should start on June 1st? Or some people have said, by the way, maybe it should start on August 1st.
My opinion?
Yeah.
August 1st.
August 1st.
I mean, yeah, where you really get into, and I changed my opinion on this because we had this conversation last year on the podcast. Right. And I thought my reasoning used to be, well, the Pacific, the Atlantic, let's sync them up. And, that way we do get these storms that come early sometimes. And it just kind of made sense to me. But since then, I've heard you and just looked at it again and go to the core of the season where the storms tend to be the big, powerful, ones that really threaten life. And that tends to be August through really October, but November too. So that's what I would vote for. Especially
through October. Yeah. Although, in 2005, we had nasty hurricanes in July and, occasionally there's a hurricane in June. There's only really been one significant one in relatively modern times in June. So, but I agree that it should not go back. I should not be earlier to take into account the fact that, sometimes we have to name storms because they meet the criteria in May, but they really are kind of wintertime origins. And then you get into, naming nor'easters or naming every low pressure system that comes along. If you take that to the extreme. So I agree with you on that. All right, so let's bring in Ken Graham from the National Hurricane Center, the director of the National Hurricane Center. He's been around every year he's been in town. It seems like we've had a really devastating hurricane. Ken has a lot of experience. He came from the New Orleans National Weather Service office and dealt with hurricanes and hurricane communications there. So let me introduce Ken Graham. Ken, welcome to the podcast. Good to have you once again.
Good to see you again.
Yeah, it's great to see you. And we were just talking about this question that was circulating when we started getting these named storms in May. This year has been quite a barrage of named storms early in the season, in fact, record-setting. Whether hurricane season in the Atlantic should move back to encompass more of these late May storms, which we seem to have found popular here the last few years. Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I get that question quite a bit, and it's good to talk about it. And you really think about the June 1st date. It's a preparedness date. I mean, you can go back, many, many decades and find where we're talking about the season beginning June 15th. I mean, it's all about preparedness. And if you think about it, anything before June 1st, most of the time, I mean, it's weaker. There's a lot of hybrid storms. Not a lot in the way of big storms and landfalls. I guess if that starts to be a trend with time, maybe we can start really having more conversations about it. But you have to realize we get severe weather outside of severe weather season. You're going to get some of these storms outside the hurricane season. It is all about preparedness. And June 1st is the target date that we have folks really start ramping up their preparedness part in their plans.
Well, that makes perfect sense. And speaking of the early season, we're off to the record earliest third named storm. And the first two got started with, almost winter-like features. Baroclinic processes is what they're called. And Cristobal is coming from this large, low-pressure system, this rotating kind of loose gyre. It's called the Central American Gyre. And, are these types of baroclinically induced and gyre-oriented type systems, are they intrinsically harder to forecast?
Yeah, they become that way. I mean, if you could go back probably before 2000, go back, a long time ago, I don't know if we would have detected some of these. I mean, we have so many more tools now at our disposal. So, I mean, that's part of the factor. But the other part is, it's part of our preparedness message that applies here too. I mean, they're hybrid systems, but at the same time, whenever you start pulling in tropical moisture, any part of it, even a hybrid storm with some tropical portions of it, you can get intense rainfall. You can have significant impacts, even in this next system, even if it ends up being stretched in some sort of hybrid system. There's a potential some areas could get 3-4 foot of storm surge. So it's still a way to keep highlighting all these impacts. The impacts could be so great that I think it's still important to be able to highlight these.
Yeah, we were talking about this Cristobal situation and how it's going to evolve. And let's just get into the technical rules a second, because we were kind of speculating, and I thought you were the guy to ask. So Amanda, formed in the Pacific, lost its surface circulation over the mountains. And so even though the kind of remnants of Amanda turned into a new system, it got a new name because the surface circulation was lost. Okay, now Cristobal is going over the land. There's a decent chance it's going to lose its core circulation, but there's this giant circulation around it, which almost certainly is what's going to get pulled north, whether there's this old Cristobal core or not. So does that, according to the rules, qualify for continuing to be Cristobal, or under what circumstances might that actually be a new storm, or can you imagine that happening?
Yeah, Bryan, I'm just not glad we're not getting back out in the Pacific and then coming back ashore, dissipating and doing this all over again. That would be a wild conversation. But no, I think what'll happen is, that'll be some of the origins. If it is the actual center that continues and gets out in the Gulf, of course it'll keep the same name. The discussion that we've had is some of the models have indicated something else that's interesting. What ultimately ends up in the Gulf was that an outshoot of convection that was far away from the center, and that actually gets developed. That's where we've had the conversation. What does that become? But if it's the original center and it continues to move north with time after it sits down there, that will keep the same name. So, we've had the same conversations here. We'll see what ultimately happens. But, either way, I tell you, sometime later this weekend or this weekend, we just, the conversation I was having here is just keep it moving. I mean, whether it develops or not, whether it's a tropical storm or a minimal hurricane, and we just got to keep that thing moving once it moves north to make sure we keep the rainfall rates a little lower.
Yeah, it looks like as a matter of fact, the circulation, if the circulation kind of dies out over land, the Cristobal circulation, you're still going to have a massive circulation going north, right? And on the right side of the storm, it looks like the winds, depending on the model you look at, and we don't know what's going to exactly happen here. The winds could be very well displaced from the center, so it doesn't really look terribly tropical in a lot of those models. But what my question really was is these kinds of systems like this, do you think that they are just always going to be difficult to forecast, that these weaker fringy storms that involve land, and or is there some kind of science that you can imagine in if not my lifetime, your lifetime, or if not your lifetime, Luke's lifetime, that is actually going to be able to kind of pin down these things? It feels like the forces involved are so chaotic and random that they might be past the line of forecastability.
Yeah, I love that question, because it's something that actually I've put in some of my the outreach presentations this year. Two different points with that question. One of them is if you look at our forecast data when it comes to our actually our verification scores, how well we do. We at the Hurricane Center, you and I've talked about this. We share what we do well. We also share things where we don't do well. We're very open with how we're doing, because I think it's important to keep everybody in tune with the state of the science. But one thing that's interesting, we had somebody over here put an analysis together to look at our verification score based on the strength of the storm. So tropical storm category 1 through category 5. It was glaringly interesting that we do better in the stronger storms. We do better with the track. We do better with the forecast when it comes to the stronger storms, because the models are able to latch onto a center. The models are able to latch onto that storm morphology, the actual characteristics of the storm. So we do better. So if you think about it, the tropical storms, these messy hybrid systems, our verification scores are actually the lowest. The other point, if I wanted to make, is really important. The state of the science, we struggle in the genesis phase. And I could put in the genesis phase, what I'm talking about is when they first develop. And you think about the hurricane hunters, the excitement that people get when they see the videos, when they go through the eye and the stadium effect. That's important, because we can get radar in there and that sort of thing. But at the very beginning, that genesis phase, that is so crucial for us to get the hurricane hunters in there. Dorian is a prime example. I really want to be open and talk about the genesis phase of Dorian. There were 3 separate centers that they were finding in the Hurricane Hunter data. Each one of those centers would have had an incredibly different outcome in Hurricane Dorian. On the left side of the cone, Bryan, it would have probably dissipated over Hispaniola. We probably would have been shredded by those mountains. Maybe some rain for us. It would have been fast. Cuba, South Florida, we would have got some rain. The center, a little bit of Puerto Rico and also Hispaniola, been a weaker system, still faster, but the center jumped. When we saw that on satellite and the hurricane hunters were out there, it jumped to the right. So that means didn't hit land for a while, and then actually got into a situation that no land, more warm water, longer track, and such a longer track that the steering currents were able to pull out, and that caused the stall. Think about that for a second. All of those are very big differences in what we feel in Florida and what we feel in the U.S. I wanted to make that point. Genesis phase is tough.
It is.
It almost sounds like a game of Plinko, where you start up at the top and you select, and who knows, if you've got 3 separate centers and such drastic outcomes, how exactly that plays out. Now, when I was in college, we opened up our books and there was a word that we learned, and a phrase, the Madden-Julian oscillation. And as we come to learn, it's an upper wave, it's kind of slow moving, and as it passes by a certain area, if it's in its positive phase, it can lead to an enhancement in tropical activity. So that was that, and then fast forward and to the Twitterverse, and this word is out there again, and you're seeing experts, and it's really cool to be able to be connected with people that have a deep knowledge and understanding of that. And I'll see the discussion about this MJO on Twitter quite often. So from the Hurricane Center standpoint, is this something that is just to look at, maybe kind of amusing, or is it an actual forecast tool that you guys use?
So I think, if you think about our forecast, most people know, we go out 5 days. But no, those are the things when you look out further out. How we get, it's you look historically, we sometimes have this early start. You get some storms in June. Then a lot of times you get a little bit of a lull before we get into the big activity in August and September. So we watch out for that. When we start seeing some of those patterns, we start saying, well, it looks like things are going to get much more active and more conducive in the environment in about 2 weeks or 1 week. We're thinking of those things, and we're sharing those things, and we'll gear up our operations thinking about that as well. It's like, let's check the schedule, let's make sure we're all on board, ready to go here in a couple of weeks when things get fired up. So no, we use it. I mean, there's a lot of science behind it. I think it's something that we always like to watch, but the big danger is this, we can't get hooked on those things, because just because we have everything comes together for a stronger period, that doesn't mean you can't get, some storms that create a lot of impacts in between some of those peak points. So we just got to realize whether that happens or not. Any time during the hurricane season, you can get something spin up, and hurricanes don't care about your timelines. It's something I've been trying to say more often. I mean, sometimes we get nice 10, 14 days notice, like on a Florence, but other times you get 3 or 4 days, like Michael. And that's why these storms don't care about your timelines, and it goes back to preparedness any time in the season.
And besides that, it's difficult to forecast hurricanes as it is. Forecasting the MJO is a whole nother can of worms. So let's go back to talking about Dorian just a second. And it's really hard to imagine what's going on in the Bahamas. They're just starting to begin to rebuild, and then COVID comes along, and it's just horrible. It's just it's horrible. We feel horribly for the folks there in Abaco. And when they were facing this storm last year, and when Dorian was hitting there, it was estimated based on the data that the winds were peaking out at about 185 miles per hour. But we know that the instrument, the SFMR, that's on the aircraft that measures at the surface of the Earth by looking at the foam on the ocean, was actually returning numbers that came in the analysis or the correlation equations that are used at the current time at higher numbers. And I know that research is underway. We've talked about this on the podcast, actually, to try and figure out what those numbers mean. Do you have any sense yet whether those readings that show the winds actually being stronger in these super strong hurricanes, we've seen it in Michael, we saw it in Irma, are real, or is it just too early with the research? And when do you think we'll have a better understanding? If we keep having these incredibly strong hurricanes, it's going to become, something that's going to be important to know, I think.
Yeah, I think there's several phases with that happens. You have what you think at the time, the data that you're getting, the estimates that we get, from aircraft and satellite. We get all those at the immediate time of the storm. But then there's the other part. So we have that. And then we go into we get into the storm reports. We start doing our post-analysis to get the actual reports out. I don't know if everybody knows, we actually do a storm report on every single named storm throughout the whole season. And people can find those online. They can read about them. There's so much work that goes on behind the scenes to put those together. Yeah,
even the 4-day storms get a report.
Yeah.
Or 4-hour storms. What am I saying? The 4-hour storms get a report. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the people internally that get the Dorians, those are the tough ones.
Exactly.
But so we did an analysis on it. So then you're talking to other countries, and you're getting the observations, you're looking at the aircraft data, you're talking to the researchers, trying to calculate. I mean, this is complicated. You got sea foam, you got angle of the plane. How is that impacting what you're seeing when it comes to the wind speed or even the waves and the estimates that we get? So all that analysis takes place. I don't want to say arguments. There's some heated debate that goes on to look at some of the data to get the report out. So then the report goes out, and it's the best we have at the time. There's something else that happens. It's called a post-analysis longer term, and we actually have researchers that go back and look at the data. Sometimes there's new science. Sometimes there's new research that you can look at old data and make new assumptions from that. So it'll still be analyzed. A storm like that, it'll be analyzed for years and years to come. You can think about something 10 years from now. They'll be looking at the latest research. They'll go back and look at that data. And if there's new science, we were not ever married to any bit of those values. If there's something that shows it stronger or weaker, we'll see what happens. We'll update those reports and get that out.
These oddball and anomalous SFMR readings have been, since Irma? Was Irma the first one where it kind of spiked above what's the highest that the SFMR kind of anomalous readings have been? Which storm produced that?
Well, I think there was some of that, and we saw that in Michael, and there had to be a lot of analysis associated with that data, and then actually us going to the Cat 5 after that analysis. But part of it was they were getting those planes going through were getting beat up pretty good. I mean, just listening to not just the radar data, but the other instrumentation, all the planes it was very turbulent. They were getting beat up. So you had to look at the angle of the plane. You had to look at it, put data side by side to see, okay, were they getting a lot of turbulence, and what was the angle of the plane, not just left and right, but forward and back. There's a lot that goes into it. So that analysis we saw in Michael was something else. There was a lot of that kind of those spikes, but they were able to really look at it, and everybody got together, got their heads together. A lot of heated debate, and everyone was pretty unanimous at the end that it was a Cat 5.
So back to Dorian for just a moment. You touched on this earlier about how the storm and the models did not handle it, especially in its infancy and its very young formative stages. And it was also, a weak disorganized storm that had some form of land interaction. Is that the same issue with Cristobal, where we've got a weak storm weakening? I mean, it made landfall as a strong tropical storm, but a weaker storm with land interaction, the same issue?
Yeah, it's the same issue, because if you think about it, we get on land, we're in Mexico, and is it going to dissipate? Is it the same center? What if it dissipates, but a new piece of convection, I don't know, I'm making it up, 100, 200 miles away, starts to rotate, that becomes the new center. That has a lot to do with the final outcome of this system and where it starts to go in the Gulf of Mexico, the strength. I remember in Michael there were multiple centers as well. So that genesis phase, and that's we could call that a genesis phase now, because you're going to get interactions with land and then some sort of reorganization. Those are the phases. There's a lot of error, and I think we talked about it last year, or definitely the year before. I can't remember. We're trying so hard. Everybody wants us to do a 6 and 7 day forecast. We want to do it too. We really want to do it too. We're doing it internally, but we're finding the error to be really significant. In some cases, 1,000 miles, or in other cases, you get recurvature over the Atlantic when ultimately it was a storm that made landfall. I'm speaking about Florence. Mm-hmm. So we're still figuring out, how do you depict that? Does that go on the cone? Is there another way we could do that? Is that a discussion? So we want to go 6 and 7 days. We really do. We've heard everybody wants it. We're struggling how to really show what that error really is.
And let's take a second. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Luca. No, go ahead.
So this was a topic we were going to bring up with you, is the 7 day forecast and the current thinking from the National Hurricane Center. So it's been a discussion for a number of years. But does what happened with Dorian in the Caribbean, maybe Cristobal, these, uncertainty with storms varies, and some have high uncertainty. So what's the latest thinking on this with the 7 day forecast, and how do you keep from telling people or warning people too soon, or over warning when a storm is just forming, even if these forecasts are kind of iffy?
Yeah, it's tough, because it's another topic that I know we've talked about, and it's all the model tracks are out there. So even if we keep saying we're trying to get to 7 days, but we've got a 5 day forecast. Listen to the 5 day forecast, but we know everybody's looking at their favorite model. It happens, especially you get 10 days and 15 days, and it's depending on your personality type, you're going to pick the one line that hits you. And every single time you're going to get pretty worked up, or another type of personality is you're going to pick the one line that doesn't come here every single time. So those are the things that we know that go on anyway. So we're trying to get to the days 6 and 7, because we know people are really looking at it. But the reality is, what do you do with 1,000 mile error? How do you not warn when you start looking at a cone that could have such a spread out to day 7 that encompasses like the entire southeast U.S. So that's what we're wrestling with. And the good news is, I did want to tell you this, because I think some of this is new. We actually have 9 total social science projects going on at the same time right now, and one of them is looking at the cone. How do we better depict these impacts? We plop the orange blob on the cone, right, to show the wind. But then there's also storm surge, Irma. There's storm surge in Jacksonville. How do we best look at that. The surveys show people are still using the cone. People are still looking at that track. So what can we do better to be able to portray all those impacts on the map? So that not only day 6 and 7, but at day 3, day 4, there's so many different impacts outside that cone. How do we fill in that? How do we show it? Because we got to find a way to show that in a picture better. So I can't wait. I'm actually really excited to get the data from these social science projects, share it with you all, and then together come up with ways that we could do better to show all those impacts on a map.
Yeah, there's two issues that come to my mind with the idea of a 7-day forecast. One of them is that a lot of storms don't live for 7 days. And if people have an expectation that they're going to get 7 days worth of warning, but the storm doesn't even exist 7 days before, this can even be a problem in 5 days, by the way, but especially at 7 days. And the other is, it's one thing to say, okay, there's 1,000 miles of error, but in the case of Florence, for example, 1,000-mile wide cone wouldn't have caught it at 7 days, right? The storm in 7 days was forecast by the models to be out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean somewhere, so certainly nowhere near remotely close to South Carolina. We're kind of pushing up against Mother Nature here in a way, aren't we? By kind of ever assuming that we can tell people 7 days in advance that they're going to be threatened or not?
And I think that's why we focus on the 5 days. We tell people, we hope to give you 5 days. Michael is going to give 3 or 4 days. So sometimes, you're going to get shorter notice depending on the situation. But think about this and why it matters. I think I want to tie, for everybody listening, I really want to tie it back to why it matters and why we're even having this discussion. Because if you go back to Florence, and you think about at day 6 and 7, you see this system recurve.
Out in the ocean, go out in the ocean, in other words.
Yeah, it's going to go out to the Atlantic. It's going to recurve. And if I'm sitting there going, oh, man, we dodged another one, all's good. The problem is, well, it didn't. That's one problem. But at day 6 and 7, there's a social science term called anchoring. And it's an interesting phenomenon because what happens is people, all of us, we all, being humans, will anchor on one of the first pieces of information we get. And what happens is you carry that through. So if the first piece of information you get is it's going to recurve, I'm okay, and you're coming up to a holiday weekend, I'm going fishing. I'm going to the hunting camp. I'm going to the fish camp. I'm going to go do my thing. And now all of a sudden your timeline's cut to a couple of days when you come back going, what is this? So I wanted to tie it back to the science and the modeling and the error, but it ties to human reaction. It ties to response and preparedness. And I wanted to bring that home because I have to be honest with you, a situation like that, I could argue that that's dangerous. So how do we best show those errors? That's what we're trying to grab and figure out.
Going back to Dorian a second, we had these model forecast challenges and not problems with the models, but it was scenarios that the models didn't handle well. One, as it was entering the Caribbean, like you were talking about and Luke was mentioning, and also as was between the Caribbean and the Bahamas, it intensified dramatically more than any model forecasted, and of course, therefore, than the official forecast was. But yet when it came near Florida, it was really a forecasting success because no watches and warnings went up for my hurricane watches and warnings for Miami-Dade and Broward, which for a hurricane that strong, that close by, was stunningly remarkable. And then it went up the coast of Florida and kind of hung to the right of the cone. So you had this situation where it wasn't as bad as it could have been, wasn't as bad as was discussed. Do you think of the issue north of Broward County, in other words, from Palm Beach County north, where there were some impacts but not as bad as was discussed, as a communications problem more than a science problem? Because the errors weren't too big, right? But there's a sense of that people, I think, that the forecast was worse than it was because not that much happened in East Central Florida, for example.
Yeah, there's so many things to think about with those questions, and it's interesting. I think, Brian, you were at a couple of my presentations and I said this. It was an accident the first time, but then I kept saying it. Little wiggles matter. I get on my tippy toes. All these topics are are amazing to talk about. So I love doing the podcast. Think of this. Go back to 1999. Remember Floyd?
Very well.
And it wasn't much of a different track than Dorian.
Right.
If you look at it, there was a little more spread in our forecast than we had in Dorian. A little more consistency with our forecast in Dorian, but not much difference. But you go back to that cone in 1999, the cone was massive. I mean, South Florida evacuated, the Carolinas. It triggered the largest evacuation at that time in U.S. history. So then you fast forward to 2019, and the cone is this dot inside this old cone. And preventing, I mean, think about this for a second, preventing somewhere around 3 million. We've tried to do some calculations. It isn't easy. About 3 million people didn't have to evacuate in Dorian. That's staggering. I mean, that's how far things have come. And I don't know. You just think about it. It's an amazing feat.
Yes, when Floyd was coming toward South Florida, and it was coming right toward Miami, and I remember getting on the phone with Mayor Alex Pinellas, Miami-Dade County. He was the mayor here at the time, and it was what should we do here? Because the forecast's all for it to turn, but boy, it doesn't look like it's turning, and people here are really nervous. And I said, if you got to do something, tell people in high rises, because at that time we were concerned because a lot of buildings hadn't been retrofitted at that time. Talk to people in high rises and talk to people on the islands in Biscayne Bay and the very low-lying areas about the possibility of having to move. Be ready to move very quickly if this thing doesn't turn. And that's what he did. They never did really order an evacuation, but kind of alerted people because we were scared that the forecasts were going to be wrong. And so the change in the amount of confidence we have today is remarkable. It's just tremendous.
Look, going back to the other part that you had in there was, it's interesting to look at the models. They actually did what they were supposed to do with that track. In other words, hindsight, the track we had a good forecast in the end, but in hindsight, there was a 100-knot error in the intensity forecast. So the models were doing what they were supposed to based on that track to go over Hispaniola and tear it apart and become whatever it was. But what a different solution. I mean, I'd have to go back and look at how many miles, but if you go that track, even 80 miles made the difference between being shredded and being a monster hurricane. That's staggering. That's going back to that Genesis phase thing where, you start getting out, 6-7 days out in a situation like that. There is a lot of inherent error, not because there's problems or that sort of thing. It's really the nature of where's the center going to be? What's the final form of this storm? I mean, it's just amazing situation to see the scenarios from dissipation and just rain to a monster Cat 5 hurricane, depending on which center took hold. That, even 27 years of doing this, Bryan, I still think about it, and it still amazes me from a science perspective.
Well, a lot of the error that we've talked about so far has been track error. And really, track error has improved greatly over the years. But track and intensity are intrinsically tied, and intensity is much more elusive. The forecasts for intensity are much more elusive. Why is that, Ken? Is it a lack of data? Is it a lack of understanding of the processes? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think there's some things in the oceans that we still need to learn. I think, it's interesting that, when you take, everybody always comments, so probably and you all get it too, right? The number one comments you probably get, into March, April, and May is, wow, the water's really warm. The Gulf is warm. I mean, you always get those comments early on.
Of course, it's warm every year, but yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, you think about those sensors at the surface, but, what's going on 300-400 feet below? What's the total heat content of that ocean? So I go back to Florence once again. Remember the eye wall replacement and never recovered. What's going on there? I mean, so there's rapid intensification situations. Michael, there's so many examples. I think I've used this stat before. There's only been 4 Category 5s to strike the continental United States that we have on record, and every one of them was a tropical storm 3 days prior.
Right.
I mean,
that's the scariest of all the stats, actually.
That gives me chills because it's the 35 storm. That's what you go back to, Andrew, Camille, and then Michael. Those are the four. So that's pretty amazing. So there's still more to learn when it comes to intensity. In the Michael situation, I mean, there was a couple different centers. The rapid intensification there exceeded all the models. In the Dorian situation, big difference between the track was going to make a big difference in the actual eventual intensity. But we have a lot to learn with intensity. Is it the oceans? And there's some projects going on with the Navy, NOAA. They're using gliders. I've seen them being made over on Virginia Key at the NOAA building. They're really fascinating. They're dropped in the water. They're trying to get a profile of the actual water temperature, salinity. Are we stirring up cold water? Are we stirring up warm water? What's going on? I know you both can too. You think of all these examples. Gustav hit the loop current in the Gulf of Mexico. So there was a thought that, we're going to get stronger. It's going to maintain this strong strength. It hit that loop current and weakened so fast. It was amazing. And it didn't have anything to do with the water. There was some dry air that got pulled in there and choked off the storm. So it's not just the one parameter. There's so many different parameters that go in here. But intensity is one. I think, for all the young folks listening, I hope there's lots of them. If you want to get into a field of meteorology and oceanography, there's a lot to be learned about the intensity forecast of tropical systems and a lot of research to be able to be turned into operations. Yeah,
the Gustav thing came on the heels of the Katrina and the Wilma and the Rita situation the year before, and especially Katrina and Rita went over the loop current and exploded into these big storms. So that was certainly in everybody's mind. We got to let you go, Ken, but I didn't want you to go without being able to talk about what is new this season. I know you're putting storm surge forecasts, which are the same ones that have been in the advisory, but putting them on a map so they'll be kind of easier to see in reference to each other. And what else are you kind of focusing on for hurricane season 2020?
Well, I think we got two big things new this year. One of them you talked about. It's that map. It's a constant, I don't want to say a struggle, right? It's a challenge to be able to put things together that's easy for social media, easy for you to take in a briefing or put on the air. I mean, we're always looking at better ways to be able to portray the information. So it's an experimental map. It's the maximum area of storm surge. So it gives you the maximum values of storm surge along the coast. It's a quick and dirty, right? It's a quick way to see, here's some trouble spots. Maybe I need to look further into it to be able to get the actual information and look at the inundation. So that's one. The other one I think is interesting. There's a new dot on the map. You're going to look at the cone.
Yeah, we're seeing it for sure.
Yeah, 60 hours. It's a new dot. And, and at first you're like, well, that's kind of interesting. No, it's a big deal for us because if you think about it, the storm surge forecast is actually a lot of times based on forward speed, and actually the structure, the size of the storm has so much to do with the storm surge, even a lot of times even more to do with than the wind speed. So that's going to allow us to have the structure of the storm in 60 hours, see the size. It's going to help us calculate the storm surge further out in time. I'm excited about that.
All right, Ken. Ken Graham, Director of the National Hurricane Center, thanks so much for your time this afternoon, and thanks for being part of our podcast. Always appreciate having you.
Definitely. Thank you both.
So, Luke, that was interesting. The whole discussion about Cristobal, and you can tell there's a debate going on at the National Hurricane Center. If it loses its center and some center forms that's more related to the Gyre and so forth and so on, there's been some speculation, I can tell, about what we're going to call this thing. So this is going to be interesting here a couple of days from now.
Yeah, a little guarded with it, but you could tell. Yeah, we just won't know. We just don't know, and they don't know either. We're just going to have to wait and see how this goes. But it's so interesting because you're right. It went Amanda to Cristobal to maybe Cristobal, maybe our D storm. We'll just have to see.
And why can't I think of what the D name is?
I can't either. That's why I said D.
All right. So, well, we'll see. We'll see. It'll be anyway. That's sort of that just shows you that Mother Nature has many more varieties than the rules allow for. Is what that really shows. So, I like to talk about past storms and past events because we can learn from them. But 2020 is an interesting year. 25 years ago was just a heck of a hurricane season, 1995, because really the world of hurricanes changed for those of us that were around then and doing it, because suddenly we started having all these storms. So it's like Mother Nature flipped a switch in 1995 and the Atlantic exploded with storms. Now, traditionally, we've thought about this as being something called the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, the AMO. And sure enough, Dr. Bill Gray at Colorado State, famous hurricane forecaster, really pioneered this thinking and these measurements to measure the temperature in the tropical Atlantic, and then it goes up and down in the number of hurricanes that are generated each year, and the number of named storms, and the amount of tropical activity goes up and down more or less with the temperature of the water. And you see general cycles in the temperature of the water. 25 to 40 years it's a little warmer, then 25 to 40 years it's a little cooler, and sure enough, 1995 seemed like we were into another positive cycle. But there are some people who make a kind of convincing argument that these cycles that we've seen, when we really are only looking back in the 20th century for the most part, because we don't have details going back before that, might be a coincidence, and it might not be quite so nice a 25 and 40 year cycle. So anyway, it's an interesting thing. When you were in school, did they discuss the AMO? Was that a thing? I mean, I know you studied more severe weather than all this tropical stuff, but was that a thing back then?
Yes, it was. And, when you're in college and you're studying things like that, especially I went to the University of Oklahoma, and you're right, ours was geared toward severe weather research, Great Plains type weather. We studied tropical weather, don't get me wrong, but it was brushed over. And you may have spent an afternoon talking about tropical, like the AMO. That may have been an afternoon or part of one lecture. But yeah, it was brought up, and it made it sound like it was fairly cut and dry. I've not heard what you're talking about right now, where it's in question. Is it more noise, or is it actual, a 25 to 45 year cycle, which is what I've been believing all this time?
Well, if you think about it, there's a very well-defined, it feels like a fairly well-defined cycle since 1995, and then you go back before 1995, kind of a down cycle going back to about 1970 or so, and then, and then you go back, and then there was the up cycle in the late 20s, 30s, and 40s, and then there was, in theory, a down cycle before that, but it gets much noisier as you go back. So really, we only have 2 up cycles and 2 down cycles, sort of. That's all we have, right? And if this really has happened throughout time for every 25 or 40 years, that's a small sample to be able to say this has always happened, this has always gonna happen. So anyway, it's just an interesting discussion that I've asked the question, gee, when I look at the 19th century data, I know it's fuzzy, it's the 19th century. For goodness sakes, what do we, really know? We don't know a whole lot. We didn't have any satellites. We didn't have any radios on ships. We didn't have all kinds of stuff. So, but when we look at it, it's not as well defined that that's a busy period. There are certainly some very busy years in the late 19th century, incredibly busy years. If they happen again, like 1886 or 1893, people would think, the world is coming to an end. There were so many hurricanes hitting the United States. But then there were other years that was like nothing. It doesn't feel as much like an up period. So, but again, the data is so iffy that hard to say. Anyway, it's an interesting topic, I think. 1995 was the 5th busiest year in the record book. If you look at just how much energy was created in the tropics, and it was quite a change. I remember it very, very well. We were thinking, oh, is this what Dr. Gray's been talking about all the time, that the switch is flipped and now we're going the other way? That was his mantra, that Florida has been lucky. Florida has been lucky all this time, and then 1995 came along.
Wait, were you already feeling, I guess, more hurricane aware with 92? Because 92 was Andrew, of course, so the waiting for the big event kind of seems like it's already happened. Are you just clearly looking at frequency over the entire Atlantic basin?
Well, in 93, kind of nothing happened. It kind of went back to normal. So we I think thought of 92 as being a little bit of a freak. So anyway, it's hard to remember exactly what happened. I don't remember what happened in 90. I mean, 94 was a fairly slow year, but I do remember that 95, given Bill Gray a lot of credit for figuring out in 95. Luke, I've lost your picture, but you're still there, right?
I'm still here.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Cool.
You should see me again.
All right. So we're just about to wrap up here. I did want to mention that 2020 is kind of a funny year. You know, we look back and kind of even anniversaries. So like 1920 was really not a big year. You know, you're looking back, 1970 was not a big year. So last year, in 2019, you had all these anniversaries that had all these mega storms. And then this year, 1995 was a big year, and we'll talk about 1995's storms in one of these later podcasts. But it's just kind of funny that was the kind of even anniversary, and the only one that really stands out as you look back.
Yeah, Opal was 95.
Yeah, Opal was one of them in 95, and the Virgin Islands got creamed, and Maryland, Louise and Maryland kind of back to back nasty storms down there. But there were just a lot of them. And it was just a very, very busy season. So we're going to wrap it up for today. We'll be back with another podcast later on in June. Now, our guest coming up in the next podcast, we don't do them every week yet. We've got other stuff to do. We'll start up every week when we get closer to August. But our next one's going to be with Eli Jackson, and he's with the National Weather Service in Washington. You may not know Eli's name, but he's responsible for a lot of stuff and he's running a program called the Hazard Simplification Project called HazSimp, and the idea is to get rid of a lot of the types of warnings the National Weather Service puts out. And the current proposal is to get rid of the advisory, so the flash flood advisory, the winter storm advisory, or winter weather advisory would go away. And so we're going to talk to Eli about that. He's kind of rolling it out to the public now and getting comments and so forth. And that'll be in about 3 weeks. But be sure on your podcast app that you set to subscribe so you know when the next podcast comes up. I'm thinking it's probably going to be 3 weeks from now. So for Luke Dorris, I'm Bryan Norcross here on Local 10 and our podcast. We appreciate you being with us. Stay safe, be well, and we'll see you the next time.